Welcome to part 3 of Presidents, Plutocrats, Paupers, and Populists. Now we're going to talk about James Garfield. Of the forgotten presidents, James Garfield is by far the most interesting. Matter of fact, he almost doesn't belong in here. There's other circumstances that cause him to be lumped in with these guys. He was born in Ohio in 1831, right? He graduated from Williams College in Massachusetts in 1856, where he returned to teach at the Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. Today it's called Hiram College, and I really do recommend that they change the name back. How cool a name is that? Western Reserve Eclectic Institute. It's so much better than Hiram. There he became a classics professor. The man spoke 4 languages fluently, right? Latin, Greek, German, and English. And within 1 year, he was made president of the college, right? He was a rising star in his college. He joined the military in the summer of 1861 when the Civil War broke out, and he was granted the rank of lieutenant colonel when he entered. And by the time we reached the Battle of Shiloh in 1862, he had already become a brigadier general. In 1863, he received a commission to be promoted to major general, and at the same time, he was elected to the House of Representatives. He didn't even run. He hadn't run for the House of Representatives, but somebody had put his name in, and he got elected. Now, he decided initially that he was going to turn down that position in the House because he'd just been promoted to Major General. And he even got counsel from Abraham Lincoln on it. And Abraham Lincoln actually asked him, he said, I need generals in Congress too. And so because of that, James Garfield is going to resign his commission. And in December of 1863, he is going to accept that position as a member of the House of Representatives representing the state of Ohio. And he'll then go on to serve 9 consecutive terms. Pretty good for an office that he wasn't running for in the first place. Okay. In June of 1880, he is going to arrive in Chicago at the Republican National Convention. At the time, there were 3 candidates running for president. Rutherford B. Hayes had decided he wasn't going to run again. Obviously, after the controversy over his election, he was kind of damaged goods anyways, right? And so the Republicans are looking for a new candidate. There are 3 standout candidates at this point, and each of them kind of fall into different factions. First, you had Ulysses S. Grant. Ulysses S. Grant was running for an unprecedented 3rd term as president, and he was the odds-on favorite. He was also the favorite of the stalwart portion of the Republican Party. These are the pro-spoils system Republicans. By this time, the spoils system had become controversial enough that you had pro-spoils systems Republicans and anti-spoils system Republicans. And you had the same thing in the Democratic Party, right? So the stalwarts were the pro-spoil system Republicans led by New York Senator Roscoe Conklin, and their candidate was Ulysses S. Grant. The anti-spoil systems were called the half-breeds, and their candidate was Maine Senator James P. Blaine, right? And so those are your 2 primary candidates, and then you had a 3rd candidate, John Sherman, who was the sitting Secretary of the Treasury at the time, and he was running as a compromise candidate between the 2. So he's kind of a middle-of-the-road guy. This was the guy that James Garfield had shown up to Chicago to stump for, right? He was stumping for John Sherman. Now, the thing about James Garfield, and this would make sense, he speaks 4 languages, very effective speaker, very good at it, right? And so he was stumping for John Sherman. The ballots get cast on the first vote for the candidate, and Grant has a majority. He has 306 ballots, but you need 399 to win. Second is James P. Blaine, and a distant 3rd is John Sherman. That's on the first ballot. Next ballot, same thing. The Grant voters stay with Grant. The Blaine's voters stay with Blaine. You might get 1 or 2 shift. And this happens over and over again. And between each casting of ballots, there are speeches given. Garfield, of course, is giving great speeches for John Sherman, and there's others. Roscoe Conklin's giving stump speeches for Grant and all that. And after 33 ballots, you still had a deadlock with Grant leading, Blaine second, and Sherman a distant 3rd. All right? On the 34th ballot, something strange happened. The state of Wisconsin cast its 16 votes towards James Garfield. And James Garfield was like, well, wait a minute, I'm not even running, right? On the 35th ballot, Garfield suddenly got 50 votes. And on the 36th ballot, he stormed ahead and got the majority needed, and he won the nomination. The dam broke, if you will, right? So here, once again, just like with the House of Representatives, now he is the Republican presidential candidate, and he wasn't even running, right? Now, his vice presidential candidate is going to be a guy named Chester A. Arthur, the man from New York, Roscoe Conklin's best friend. Now, Garfield himself is an anti-spoil system. He would be considered a half-breed, right? He doesn't believe in the spoil system. Matter of fact, he wants to take it all down. But in order to win the presidency, he's going to need to have the support of the stalwarts. So in order to get that unity, he allowed Chester A. Arthur, a stalwart, to be made his vice presidential candidate to unify the Republican Party behind the ticket, and he's going to end up winning. He wins the very pivotal state of New York, and this is probably driven a lot by Roscoe Conklin and Chester A. Arthur, which if he hadn't won, he would have lost the election. Now, as president, he's actually very progressive. He's ahead of his time. He's a progressive before progressivism was popular, right? For example, he supported increasing trade with Latin America and Asia, right? He advocated civil rights and proposed government-funded educational programs to help improve the lives of African Americans in the South, right? He even appointed African Americans to important posts in his cabinet and in his administration. Like, for example, Frederick Douglass. He appointed him to the District of Columbia Recorder of Deeds office. Blanche Bruce was made the Register to the Treasury. But his top priority was to attack the spoils system, and he wanted to eliminate it. This really leads to a fight with Roscoe Conklin, right? And ultimately, Conklin's going to end up resigning from the Senate in protest. Garfield plans on tearing down the spoils system, but he never gets it done. What happened? What went wrong? Well, what happened was James Garfield got dead, right? What happened was this man, Charles Guiteau. And when you look at Charles Guiteau here, I'm sure you can see he clearly looks like a sane-minded, very well put-together individual. Yeah, right. This is actually his glamour shot that he had taken literally days before his execution. And yeah, he's as crazy as he looks, right? Charles Guiteau was from Freeport, Illinois. He was 39 years old when he killed James Garfield. He had a real rough childhood, right? He lost his mother when he was only 7 years old, and he was raised by his father, who was very strictly religious and a follower of the Oneida Cult, right? The Oneida Cult was a cult led by John Humphreys Noyes. Noyes was the founder of this cult, and this cult was included a commune which called for free love, shared labor, and mutual criticism, right? When Charles Guiteau turned 18 years, he moved away from home and he moved into the commune in order to experience this free love, shared labor, and mutual criticism. And what he found is that he was getting none of the free love. As a matter of fact, the women in the Oneida Cult referred to him as Charles Get Out. He was getting a lot of the shared labor, and boy, was he getting a heaping helping of the mutual criticism. It was so bad that when he left, he actually sued for lost wages for his shared labor. He's going to lose that lawsuit. Afterwards, he's going to take on many odd jobs, right? He's going to become a lawyer, even though he was never qualified and he never won a case, a bill collector, a preacher. He wrote religious tracts. None of these really panned out. So how does this guy, who's clearly the one thing he is full-time crazy, how does he get involved with President James Garfield? Well, back in this time, you didn't really go out as a presidential candidate. You didn't go out like you see today, going out giving speeches, going to debates. And that's not how it was done. That's why, like, for example, that's why John Sherman wasn't at the Republican convention. He had his people, James Garfield, there for him. It was seen as unseemly for you to go out there and campaign for yourself. So in order to drum up support for a candidate, you would hire people to give stump speeches. And in New York City, Charles Guiteau was hired by the Republican Party to give stump speeches. Now, Guiteau was a stalwart. He was a big supporter of General Grant. Matter of fact, he even went so far as to write a speech for General Grant. And then General Grant doesn't win the nomination. So what does he do with his speech? Well, he crosses out the word Grant, writes Garfield. Done. Now, we can find historically only two cases in which we know he gave a stump speech there in New York City. Both times to small groups of African Americans, right? Now, that's the extent of his involvement in the campaign. Two known stump speeches to small crowds. But remember, Garfield wins New York State. If he loses New York State, he loses the election. Charles Guiteau lives in Charles Guiteau world. So in Charles Guiteau's mind, why did Garfield win? Well, obviously, it's clearly because of his awesome stump speeches carrying the state of New York. So what does he do? He goes to Washington, D.C. to get his spoils appointment. He wants to be named ambassador to France, right? So he shows up along the line of a whole lot of other prospective spoils appointees to get his just deserves.